You're listening to The Artist Athlete, episode 14, You Tall Drink of Water. Who writes these? Oh, wait, I do. This podcast is dedicated to circus. It's a place for professionals in the industry to share their stories, viewpoints, and information, and a place for outsiders to get information about this amazing art form. Hey friends, fans, and enemies, I'm Shannon McKenna, and I'm the host of the Artist Athlete podcast and the founder of theartistathlete.com. One very important official announcement, a little piece of Artist Athlete business for you all, is that I have launched the Patreon page for the Artist Athlete podcast. So if you would like to become a monthly donor to the Artist Athlete podcast, you can go to patreon.com/theartistathlete. And listeners who give $5 a month or more can have early access to episodes. You're entered to win cool prizes like some of the content that I have for sale on theartistathlete.com and a lot more. There are levels you can give as little as $1 or as much as $500. And if you give $500, you will become a very special co-host on The Artist Athlete. So check it out. Go to patreon.com/theartistathlete to subscribe today. Today's guest is a little different in that he's not directly in the circus field, but I wanted to have him on anyway because I think he can provide a lot of help to our community. His name is Dr. Kip Matthews, and he's a performance and sports psychologist. With 20 years of experience in the field, he works with dancers, musicians, and other artist athletes to improve performance and overcome mental blocks. He joined me over Skype to talk about how circus artists can employ some of his mental techniques in our own training and performance. Here's my interview with Dr. Kip Matthews. Hello, how are you?
Doing just fine. How about yourself?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much. Can you hear me okay?
I hear you just fine. How about your end?
Awesome. Yeah, I can hear you great. Cool. Well, thank you so much for your time and coming on the podcast. I really appreciate it. Dr. Matthews, what do the people call you?
Yeah, you can call me Dr. Matthews or Dr. Kip.
Okay.
Dr. Kip will be fine.
Awesome. And can you tell me and the audience a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Yes, I'm a licensed psychologist here in Georgia, and I specialize in sport and performance psychology. My training and experience has also helped me to focus on doing career and life planning with my clients as well. About 15 years ago, my colleague and I founded a group practice in Athens, Georgia, where we provide general counseling services focusing on anxiety and mood concerns. However, a large portion of my practice is focused on helping athletes, musicians, and dancers to achieve their best performance. My educational background is in both counseling psychology as well as kinesiology or sports science. And additionally, I have a strong background in music, which helps me to understand the needs of performance artists.
Are you a musician?
Yes, I am. Trombone was my instrument of choice growing up.
Oh, wow. That's very cool. And so what was the interest in sports psychology specifically?
Yes, well, the way I got into sports psychology is a long story, and I don't think we have time for that today, but it was a very circuitous route to get me to where I'm at right now. For the longest time, I had imagined myself as a musician, and I was even a performance major at the beginning of my undergraduate education. However, I quickly realized that I probably just did not have the talent level to get very far in the field. And so after doing some soul searching and taking a variety of classes, I was watching the 1984 Olympics on TV that summer, and I saw these talking heads on TV who were called sports psychologists, and I was really intrigued by what they were talking about. And I said, hey, this is a great way for me to integrate my love of sport. I played a variety of different sports growing up, and my love of psychology. And so when I got back to school there in the fall, I was lucky enough to stumble across a sports psychologist who was one of the top people in the field at the time. And I went and consulted with him about how to get into sports psychology. So we actually had about an hour and a half, 2-hour conversation in that very first meeting. And he advised me to double major in both sports science and psychology, which I did. And then I went out to
And what is a sports science major?
Yeah, a sports science major, they study movement. They look at like biomechanics, like how does the body move, the physical principles involved behind that. We also study exercise physiology and anatomy and getting some good background with that.
Awesome. So it's the body and the mind kind of together in this double major, it sounds like.
That's right. That's exactly right. And then I went to UCLA studying sports psychology. And then around that time, after being out there for a bit, I then transferred to the counseling psychology program at the University of Tennessee. I was really concerned about my ability to become licensed at the time. So I transferred into counseling psychology and continued to do my research in sports psychology. And then I did my pre-doc internship at the University of Maryland at their counseling center. And I was lucky enough to be able to spend a part of my time over in their athletic department working with athletes there. And since that time, I've been at various universities working with student athletes as well as the general student population before moving into private practice, like I said, about 15 years ago. And it is at that point I really began specializing in sports psychology.
That's awesome. So how do athletes or dancers or musicians differ from the normal populations?
Well, that's a really good question. One thing that I've noticed is that musicians and dancers and other performance artists, they really feel their work. And by that, I mean that as a group, they often have a very deep emotional connection to their performances. And so while that may also happen for athletes, it doesn't get discussed as much, nor is it experienced in much the same way. Also, additionally, performance artists often have displayed an unusual amount of commitment to their discipline. This commitment is often exemplified by their motivation, their perseverance, as well as their artistry, and that has allowed them to get to the level that they have accomplished and achieved. And so one interesting thing about performance artists is that a key component to performing arts is the element of performing in front of others. And so to excel and do your best means being able to have optimal focus, being able to maintain your concentration, as well as getting your nerves under control, and also dealing with issues of perfectionism that can accompany this field. And so if you think about how many jobs require you to have your work to be on public display, and then on top of it be judged or critiqued by those individuals.
Sure.
Not too many. So that's the thing. That's what separates performance artists from the normal population.
And so how do you help people with this issue of anxiety or performance? Is it called performance anxiety?
Yes, performance anxiety. Yes. It really depends on what they're kind of coming to me for. That what I've noticed is that the presenting concerns of these groups, they tend to fall into two different areas. There's one group of performers who are doing really well, but they want to take their art and their performance to the next level. And so in other words, they're really seeking performance enhancement. And generally, in their years of training, they've typically focused on learning the physical skills and integrating that with their artistry. However, typically little, if any, attention was ever placed on the psychological skills that might impact their ability to achieve those desired results. And so what we can do is by integrating the psychological skills training into their training regimen, then they can expect to move to greater heights, allowing their abilities to kind of shine through in better ways.
And what are those psychological skills?
Yes. So there's some the psychological skills can include cognitive therapy techniques, which to help them kind of harness the power of their inner voice. We all have that kind of inner voice that kind of chatters inside of our head. And so what we can do is...
I feel like I have 12 inner voices that chatter inside my head.
Some days more than others, right?
Yeah.
So, we can use some cognitive techniques to help them kind of harness the power of that inner voice. There's also some emotional management techniques that can be helpful to deal with the stress of performing, or even the depressed mood and grief that sometimes comes with an injury or career termination. I also use like guided imagery and visualization, which can be helpful in learning new tricks or even managing performance nerves, or even helping them to establish their goals as to where they want to move to in their career. Probably another technique is goal setting, which is essential in helping to maintain motivation over time. That when you're training day after day after day for years at a time, if you're not clearly setting good specific goals, then that can lead to burnout very quickly. Another technique that I often use is self-hypnosis techniques that can help the artist make some desired changes.
How does that work?
Yeah, hypnosis as well as self-hypnosis. I like to teach self-hypnosis because they don't need to have me around. So that's always a good thing. And so what you're doing there is self-hypnosis is not magic, but the results of it can be pretty magical. And all it is just a state of very, very focused attention. And what you're doing is you're focusing that attention to some goal or purpose. And so a technique that I might teach them will involve this affirmation technique where they identify 3 different areas they would like to see improvement, either with their performance or even their general lives. And we can then focus that attention to those 3 areas. And it's almost like you're sending a direct message to your unconscious as to what you want the new reality to be there. And that's how that works. And nothing more, nothing less. And then probably the most important thing that I work with people on is to be able to pivot from what I call an outcome focus to a process focus in their approach to their discipline.
Wow, yeah.
So often in Western culture, we focus and judge ourselves based on a particular outcome, like, did I land the audition? Did I get this particular job? Did I get an A in this class? And so forth. However, there are very few outcomes that we actually have direct control over. And so what I like to do is to help the person pivot more toward a process focus. So if they want to become a better aerial artist, what are the techniques and strategies that are going to help me to excel in that domain? And those will be the things I'll judge myself on.
But didn't you just say one of those techniques would be goal setting, which is an outcome-oriented technique?
Yeah, that's right. But goals need to have certain characteristics. And one of those essential characteristics is that the goal needs to be something that you have control over.
So what would an example of a goal be?
Yeah, so a bad goal would be, all right, I want to win the next 3 games. Okay, I can't control whether or not I win the game. A referee or a judge at an audition might be having a bad day and make an incorrect call. However, a good goal, if you can remember the acronym of a SMART goal, this is an acronym. The S stands for specific. You really want the goal to be specific. That you often hear people talking about, well, I want to lose some weight. Well, that's a pretty general goal. It's like, okay, exactly how much weight are you talking about? Or if I want to run faster, exactly how much faster are you wanting to run? It also needs to be measurable so that you can judge your progress toward that goal. It also needs to be adjustable so that if I set the goal too high or too low, I can adjust it to fit kind of where I'm at that particular point. It also needs to be realistic. So right now, as a 50-something-year-old, if I were to try to set a goal of being able to dunk a basketball for myself at this point in my life, that would be pretty unrealistic. Whereas years ago, it was very realistic. And then the last thing is you want to have a time frame on that goal that you want to have a very specific time frame. So in 1 month, I want to be able to shave like 0.2 of a second off my quarter mile time. And what you want to do is also make sure that you have both a set of short-term goals as well as long-term goals. And that will just keep your motivation going consistent over time.
I'm writing all this down for my own
Sure.
for my own self-psychology.
There's actually a really good book written by Carol Dweck, D-W-E-C-K.
Okay.
She's been a prolific researcher in the area of motivation. And she actually, several years ago, came out with a book called Mindset, The Psychology of Success. Mm-hmm. And there she tried to integrate years and years of research on motivation into that one book. And she does a really good job of explaining what an outcome focus and a process focus is.
Interesting.
But if you look at some of the most successful coaches, whether you're talking about basketball or football or whatever, that they're very good at utilizing a process focus, even though their jobs depend on whether or not they win or lose their games.
That's fascinating. Mm-hmm. Wow. Okay, so you said that there are two types of people who come to you. There are the people who are doing well and want to heighten or improve their performance. What's the other type of people that come to you?
That's right. So a second group is made up of those individuals who are struggling with their performance for some reason. It could be either like stage fright, audition stress, or even like recovering from an injury. And in these cases, the person may have been performing at a high level, and then something went wrong that began to interfere with their performances. And this can be a really frightening time for the artist athlete because they may fear and wonder if they will ever get back to where they were performing at previously. And so the stress and anxiety can definitely impact the execution of these motor skills, and at an even very slight level. But at those high elite levels, that can mean the difference between nailing the audition and being sent back home.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Because there's a very restricted range when you're talking about elite athletes.
Yeah. I want to break down a couple of these. So how do you counsel people who have audition nerves? Or people who excel, but then they get in the room for an audition and choke, if you will.
Yes.
I'm sure there's a better psychological term, but...
No, audition nerves is a good term. I can't tell you the number of times I've worked with people with audition nerves. It is very common for artist athletes. It can feel like your whole career hinges on whether or not you successfully pass a specific audition. But as we know, that's not really the case, but we act and respond as if that was totally the case. Mm-hmm. And so for me...
It feels like the case. When you're in the moment, it feels like life or death.
That's right. And our bodies respond as if it's a life and death situation. That our heart rate goes up, our pupils are changing size, our tension begins to kind of get in our muscles, and all that affects our movement. So whether you're talking about a musician being able to play a guitar or a flute or any other instrument, or like an aerial artist or an athlete, at the combine, those can be very detrimental to the performance. And so what I like to do to start off with is to get a good history of their performance, including a detailed history of their performance anxiety, like when did this begin, what, if anything, triggered these audition nerves. And then I'd use that information to make some choices about which interventions will likely be helpful. And then depending on the person, I'll probably integrate some psychoeducation into the process to help them better understand the relationship between anxiety and performance. And so just briefly, what that looks like is if you're not aroused enough, you're going to be flat during your performance. It's those moments when you're just kind of going through the motions.
Sure. It's that idea of having a little bit of nerves is a good thing, right?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Similarly, if you're too anxious, you're going to perform just as poorly. But there is that sweet spot that you just pointed out, known as the peak performance zone, that is unique to each athlete. And so my goal is to help them not only identify where that area is for them, but also how to get themselves there. And so that's going to involve teaching them like some emotional management techniques. So if they're feeling flat, how do they get themselves pumped up a little bit to get to the optimal area? Or if they're too highly aroused, in the case of audition nerves, how do they calm themselves down on demand so they can perform as they need to? And a big part of that is helping them to create a pre-performance routine to help them become more consistent in their auditions and performances. And that can vary very widely depending on the athlete or the musician or other artists. But generally, you want to have about a 15 to 30-minute routine that you do prior to audition that gets you into the right headspace to do your best.
This podcast is brought to you by The Artist Athlete. Did you know that The Artist Athlete is more than just a podcast? It's a growing online resource for students of the aerial arts to deepen their journey to badassery by accessing techniques approved by physical therapists and master coaches in the industry. Our current spotlight is on the fundamentals of aerial alignment, a practical manual for hanging upside down. This online manual is a step-by-step guide. It is complete with photos, videos, and exercises that you can implement immediately to help you gain the strength and awareness you need for an aerial practice that promotes shoulder health and longevity and good posture upright, so you don't walk around like a gorilla. But don't just take my word for it. Here's circus physical therapist Dr. Jen Crane of Cirque Physio to tell you more.
The fundamentals of aerial alignment is an absolute must-have for every aerialist of every level. I can't even tell you how many shoulder injuries I treat that are a direct result of rushing past the basics in an attempt to get a trick too soon. In the manual, Shannon deconstructs the fundamentals, including the correct muscular engagement to safely arrive in these positions and the rationale for why it matters. Of course, in addition to all of these fabulous pearls of wisdom, the book is also ridiculously fun to read. It's been lovingly garnished with the Shannon humor we all know and love.
Thanks, Jen. Cirque Physio is also featured in the book to give scientific insight into why it all works. Pick up your copy today by going to theartistathlete.com and clicking e-manuals. Listeners of the podcast can get a 10% discount by typing in the offer code PODCAST at checkout. Again, that's theartistathlete.com, offer code PODCAST. Now, back to the show.
I have a question also about mental blocks for specific tricks or skills. I remember I was doing a show in Australia, and the trapeze artist on the show did this one trick, and he did it every day for years. He did it every day in the show for a month and a half. And then we moved to a new venue, and all of a sudden he couldn't do it anymore. He just was like, I don't know what it is. I've done this 1,000 times, but all of a sudden I'm scared to do it. How would you treat my friends?
Yeah, and that's an interesting case. And the more that the trapeze artist begins to think about it, the more difficult it is for him to execute that trick.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
So just as a backstory before I talk a little bit about that sure. When we learn a specific skill or technique, there's a schema that develops in our brain on how to execute that skill. And when we practice it over and over, that schema becomes much more established. And what happens is, if we start to think about that skill and how to execute it, what begins to happen is that automatic pilot, we take it off automatic pilot, and that's when problems can begin to arise in those moments. And so what we want to do is help them reestablish that autopilot nature of their performance.
Interesting. So it's when you become more conscious or aware of the movements you're doing after making them unconscious, that's when problems arise? Is that what you're saying?
Yes. So I play a lot of pickup basketball, and one little, I guess this is using it for the dark side, but if the person I'm guarding is just going crazy with nailing all their shots, I might point out to them something they're doing with their shot. You know, it may be like, have you ever noticed that your elbow goes out a little bit when you make that shot? Just by merely suggesting that to the person, they begin thinking about it, and they can't shoot as well in those moments. So I feel a little bit bad about it, but not too
Psychological warfare.
Exactly. So athletes can have these blocks for a number of different reasons, but the most likely culprit is either experiencing an injury during a routine or witnessing someone get hurt, while performing. But as you pointed out, it can be a significant change, like a change of venue, what you're doing. Another thing that can lead to a block is when an athlete is putting a lot of pressure on themselves to perform perfectly at that high level. And so to help overcome these blocks, it may be helpful to break the trick or skill down into smaller chunks, and then helping them to master those easier chunks to begin with. And then after that, you can integrate the more challenging parts of the trick. And however, if that's not possible, you may want to utilize what I call visual imagery to help them overcome the block. Here, what they do is they're going to imagine themselves doing that skill or trick perfectly. And you may even want to utilize a video of someone else doing the trick, and then that's also very helpful to them. And then what you would do is you would have them to imagine themselves doing it from a first-person perspective, as if they're inside their own body. And this will not only help to generate some muscle memory, like that schema that I was talking about, but it also will help them to lessen their anxiety when it comes time to perform the actual skill or trick.
Interesting.
So an interesting side note. So there you have them to imagine doing it perfectly if they're having a block or in that situation. However, if the aerial artist or anyone else is doing something really well, then what you may want to do is actually have them to imagine making a mistake during the trick or skill and then successfully recovering from that mistake. So like for that trapeze artist, you might have them to imagine going through the entire routine, but at some point messing up during a part of that routine, but successfully recovering from that mistake. Because rarely do we ever do something perfectly. And so by imagining how am I going to handle certain situations, it will instill a sense of confidence in them so that if something does come up, they know they've been there before and they can continue to go on through the performance.
I'm just thinking as you're saying that, I've done performances 40 feet in the air where imagining messing up was not an option for me. I don't think I would employ that technique ever. We were just in complete self-imposed denial about how high we were in the air. And that was kind of what got us, that's what got us through. But that's great. So, yes, mental blocks, audition nerves, and then you mentioned injury as well, which I think is really fascinating in our field, because you mentioned before this idea of people who are performers or artists and athletes being incredibly committed and having this aspect of identity kind of tied up in what they or what we do.
Yes.
And I've seen injury just devastate people because of that. Mm-hmm. So could you speak to some of the behavioral patterns you've noticed in performers who are injured and strategies people can use or help others to get through these times?
Yeah. When an injury happens, as you pointed out, it can be really devastating for the artist athlete there. By
the way, I really appreciate how many times you've said artist athlete. It's really great.
Absolutely, yeah. It's a very important integration for your discipline there. Well, one thing is that you need to understand performance psychologists can play a vital role in the recovery from an injury, not only helping them to deal with the emotional response stemming from the injury, and that can include grief, fear, anxiety, everything else too. There's no one typical response that a person might have to the injury. Sometimes there is even a sense of relief for some if they feel like they were getting a bit burned out. They may welcome a chance to just kind of take a break for just a little bit. And so helping them to deal with the emotional response would be helpful on getting them back sooner than later. But also certain visualization techniques can actually help them facilitate the healing of an injury as well. There's research studies that have shown that visualization, for example, someone who's torn their ACL, there are certain techniques that I've actually used that helps the ACL to get back stronger when they are in recovery there.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So what are those visualization techniques involved?
Yeah, it's pretty technical, but what you do is you would have them to do some guided imagery and imagine their muscles getting stronger, which is very important, like an ACL or a knee injury, because the muscles will help to stabilize the knee. And in fact, what we see is that not only do those ligaments reattach faster and get stronger, but the muscles also develop a bit faster too.
Interesting. So do you sit there and you like picture an ACL, like the actual muscle, and picture it mending, or do you picture the movement you would do that requires a strong or flexible ACL?
Actually, both.
Okay.
The first will be actually imagine the ACL getting stronger and bigger, as well as the muscles. But then later on, before they can actually start executing the skills, you can actually have them to imagine executing the different moves with their limbs. And what happens is the brain and muscle connection still is there. And so even though you're not actually executing the movement, the nerves are innervating the muscles in the exact pattern as if you actually were moving. So it helps to kind of keep that muscle schema intact during that whole time. So you can get back, when you are able to be cleared to perform, you're able to get that back there much sooner than later.
Wow, that's fascinating.
And also, the sports psychologist can also help the athlete to not get too down or become too fearful about having another injury. That's another thing that often happens, that, it's not only the grief around having been injured in the first place, but more often than not, there's this fear of getting hurt again. And so by talking about those fears and emotional reactions, the athlete can confront these challenges and improve their psychological resilience. And so we really need to think about resilience as being like a muscle, that the more you use it, the stronger it's going to become. And the American Psychological Association, they actually had a whole campaign around resilience. And people can go to the apahelpcenter.org and get downloaded materials about psychological resilience and learn some strategies to develop that.
Cool. Yeah. Psychological resilience is helpful in all realms of life.
Definitely.
So that's awesome. And it's apa.org?
Yeah. This specific site is apahelpcenter.org.
Helpcenter.org.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. I'll put that in the show notes as well for everybody.
Sounds great.
Awesome. That's great. And I also find that there's a social aspect to injury as well. People experience this feeling of letting their teammates or their cast down when they get injured.
Yeah, tremendous guilt can come from that.
And isolation too, because you go from seeing the same people every day, you go from showing up to work, and then all of a sudden you're not allowed to. How can a sports psychologist help people cope with that aspect?
Yes, that while they may not be able to be out there on the field or performing with their other cast members or their other teammates, what you will have them do is to talk with their coach or their manager about other ways they may be able to be involved, maybe serving as a bit of a mentor or an assistant coach with their other teammates. They can take on more of a kind of a cheerleader kind of role with their team. That's also very helpful, but helping them to figure out what kind of role would be good for them. But that may not be helpful at the very beginning because it's really hard for them to be around their teammates or their other cast members if they're not able to do it themselves. And so they may need a bit of a time to have that break and just get a little bit of psychological distance from that.
Gotcha.
Mm-hmm. So that's where you need to really help understand each unique athlete. For some, that may take longer than others.
So what's the weirdest problem you've ever seen or the weirdest case?
Yeah, I was thinking about that, when you sent that question. And I'm not really sure.
It's always my favorite one to ask medical professionals in any scope is just what's the weirdest thing you've ever witnessed?
Exactly. So I'm not sure what the most unusual problem is that I've ever encountered. Mm-hmm. However, one intriguing phenomenon that I just find to be fascinating is the yips. Have you ever heard of that term, the yips?
No, I'm not familiar with it.
Yeah, golfers in your listening audience, they probably will be very familiar with this term. The yips occurs when an athlete suddenly cannot execute a well-learned skill. They try, and then all of a sudden they just cannot do it. Like I said, you see it a lot in golfers who are trying to putt a golf ball. But you can also see it in other disciplines. For example, a pitcher who is trying to make a throw over to first base, or even a catcher who is just returning the ball back to the pitcher. That they've done this tens of thousands of times, and then all of a sudden they just cannot execute that skill in the way that they have been in the past. And like I said earlier, the more they begin thinking about it, the more difficult it then becomes. There is a pitcher in the major leagues last year who he just cannot throw over the first. He just refuses to throw over the first base when there's a runner there. And so I find that to be a very intriguing situation. And it just comes out of the blue. There's nothing that cause it to happen.
You just lose it for a while.
Just lose it for a while, yes.
Huh. And then does it come back on its own as well?
It can, but that's some of the times that's when a person might come to me because it is very distressing. And so I've had various golfers and other athletes kind of come to me in those situations. And what often happens is that inner voice, it begins to kind of get run amok at that point, and they really kind of get down themselves, like, oh my gosh, I can't even make a throw over the first, or I can't even make a 2-foot putt. And so in those moments, you really help them learn how to rein in that negative chatter and kind of channel it in a much more effective kind of self-talk.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, with my students, I call that suffering your suffering.
Yes.
If you can't do something and then you perseverate over the fact you can't do it, you're just making it worse.
I love that phrase. I'm going to have to keep that for myself as well.
Don't suffer your suffering. I also had a question for you about personality types in high-level athletes. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if you found this or not. Like, I'm thinking Myers-Briggs or these kinds of personality tests you can do. If you've noticed any kind of trend towards a certain type of personality that you see in high-level athletics or high-level achievers.
Yes. In my experience, in working with elite athletes, what I've noticed is that they generally will have a greater level of maturity, discipline, and even emotional management to even begin with. And these are often the qualities that have helped them to get where they're at that particular point. So, for example... Interesting,
because I do not think of most artists as incredibly emotionally mature. They're emotional, but...
But if you think about it, they have only gotten there to that level by having some of those skills to begin with.
It's true, yeah, for sure.
And so, like, when I'm working with elite youth athletes, I've seen those same qualities and skills, and they can appear much more poised and mature than what their chronological age would suggest. Like a 13-year-old can talk to me as if they're like an 18 or 19 or 20-year-old. It's amazing. There's another thing, too, that we've seen in the research, and that what we've noticed is that successful athletes tend to have much lower levels of tension, depression, anger, and even fatigue and confusion, while at the same time having much higher levels of vigor than the normal population. And they call that the iceberg profile. And that's been one consistent finding that they've noticed for decades that successful athletes display.
The iceberg profile?
Yeah, the iceberg profile.
And that means that can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah. There is an instrument called the Profile of Mood States, and it measures people on each of those areas I just mentioned, like tension and depression and vigor and so forth. And consistently, athletes at the higher levels will have much more lower levels of tension than normal of tension, depression, anger, fatigue, and confusion, and much higher levels than normal of vigor in terms of energy and so forth than the normal population. Whereas the normal population, they're kind of flat across each of those areas. But when you plot out the successful athlete scores on that profile of mood states, they'll have much lower levels on 5 of those areas and a much higher level of vigor, creating this kind of iceberg appearance.
Interesting. Because I wonder if that's, it's like this cause and effect or chicken and egg thing, right? Because exercise will help you relax or decrease your tension, and it will give you more energy. So is it the fact that they are professional exercisers, in a way, that causes this? Or is it that they already have this and that lends them to being better exercisers?
Well, that's a really good question. And in fact, it's both. Those lower levels have allowed them to do better with their exercise and performance and so forth, but also merely the fact that they are engaged in that kind of physical activity day in and day out, it does allow them to have that positive emotional response to it as well. That one thing that people talk about is like the runner's high or the role of dopamines, leading people to feel better after exercising. And it's a bit more complicated than that. That what happens is there's actually two different stages of activity that goes on in the brain when a person exercises. That when we exercise for like 30 minutes, maybe, or even an hour, that most of your emotional positive feelings are coming from the ramping up of serotonin and norepinephrine in the brain. Both of those are neurotransmitters. And when you have a bit more of that floating around your brain, you tend to be a little bit happier and content with life. But then what we've noticed is that the dopamine response, which is the body's kind of natural opiate, it's a painkiller, that if you're exercising at a very high intensity for more than an hour, that's when the dopamine begins to get ramped up at that point. And so you can have this incredible sense of blissfulness. You're on this incredible high that people talk about. But that can only come after exercising for longer periods of time at a much higher intensity.
Wow, this is all such great information. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
So what advice would you have to someone who wanted to become a sports psychologist? What's the path to do that?
Yeah, that ideally you want the person to have a background in both sports science as well as psychology. And so when we're talking about the performance of motor skills, such as those found in aerial artists, there's a very strong interplay between one's mental state and the ultimate execution of a particular skill. And so here in the United States, the term psychologist is a licensed, protected term. Not anybody can go out and call themselves a psychologist, or else they'll get in trouble. But in order to become a psychologist, only those individuals who have gone through very specific graduate coursework and applied training and supervision are eligible to become licensed psychologists. And then on top of that, I really would recommend and advise the person to get at least a master's degree background in sports science, and then a doctoral degree in either clinical or counseling psychology, with their training and research being done on sport and performance psychology. So it's a long route, to be able to get there, but I think it's one that is well worth it at the end of the day.
Sure. And if they wanted to work with artist athletes specifically, I'm thinking, do you know if the New York City Ballet has a sports psychologist on hand or on staff?
I do not know about the New York City Ballet specifically, but what I have noticed is that more and more sport teams are hiring sports psychologists as consultants. It's also being talked about in the area of performance art as well. Like there is a trade publication like for professional musicians, and there are regularly occurring articles that talk about the use of sports psychologists to help them perform as a musician better too. So it is a growing area.
Awesome.
Yeah.
And if someone wanted to find a sports psychologist for themselves, how would you recommend they go about that?
There are a couple of different ways. One is to contact Division 47, which is Sport and Exercise Psychology of the American Psychological Association. You might be able to find some names through that.
And can you say it one more time?
Yes, it's Division 47.
Division 47.
Of the American Psychological Association. And it's the Sport and Performance Psychology Division of APA. There's also an Association for Applied Sports Psychology, AASP.org, and they maintain a database of certified sports psychologists. And then also, as most people do, there's also Google that's out there. And, going to Google and looking up, I would suggest performance psychologists, sport and performance psychologists, that they may have a bit better understanding of not only athletics, but also performance arts as well.
And what advice would you give yourself at the beginning of your career, specifically?
There's probably two pieces of advice. One is that I would give the first would be that it's never too early to begin financial planning for retirement. As I have gotten older, I have greatly appreciated the importance of planning for retirement. And I'm constantly told, you need to start sooner. You need to start sooner. So
Compounding interest is a real thing.
That's exactly right. And probably the second is that it's always important to maintain a healthy work-life balance. Be clear about what your priorities are, and make sure that you make choices and decisions that are consistent with what those priorities are. And like, for example, when my kids were younger, I made a very conscious decision about not seeing clients in the late afternoon so I could attend after-school events with them and to be able to enjoy that experience. And if I had not done that, I would have had a lot of regret.
Well, thank you so much for all of this information.
Oh, it's been a wonderful opportunity to talk with you.
Yeah, if people want to find you online, where can they go?
Yes, they can find me online on Twitter. My handle is at Dr. Kip Matthews with two T's. And I also have a website. It's drkipmatthews.com. And people can feel free to email me or message me, and I'll try to get back with them as soon as I can on that.
Cool. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, and thank you for bringing the Artist Athlete podcast to your listeners.
It's my pleasure. So fun. I have a blast doing it.
I bet so.
That was my interview with Dr. Kip Matthews. Circus is such a special and particular art form. And Dr. Matthews really articulated this very well when he talked about how artist athletes feel our work. We're not just out there doing something. There's a deep emotional connection to the work that we do, which may or may not exist in other fields. And combined with the fact that our work is constantly on public display in front of audiences, day in and day out, it's no wonder that so many of us suffer from perfectionism and or performance anxiety. I've observed this time and time again in my peers and experienced this to a pretty large degree in my own work. And so it was so refreshing to have Dr. Kip on the show and help clarify some of the practical techniques we can all employ. One of the techniques that really stuck out to me was goal setting. For this, Dr. Kip used the acronym SMART, S-M-A-R-T, to discuss the features of a good goal. A goal must be specific, M, measurable, A, adjustable, R, realistic, and T, have a certain time frame around it. And actually, when I think about this in terms of my students. A student will say to me, I want to get stronger. And this, friends, fans, and enemies, is not an example of a good goal, right? It's not enough just to say, I want to get stronger, or I want to have better technique. Instead, it's more helpful to be very specific, to say, I want to do a straight arm inversion. And take it even further. Let's get something measurable. I want to be able to do 10 straight arm inversions. This is an adjustable number, right? So you could say, all right, well, I can't do 1, so maybe 5, which is totally realistic for me because I've been training for a little while. And I want to be able to do it in 6 months. 10 straight arm inversions in 6 months is a good goal. And then you can start to break it down into smaller goals. I want to be able to do 1 straight arm inversion 3 times for the next week. You can do this not just with skills, but also in creation. I will often give myself little exercises like, I want to have 15 seconds of choreography finished and filmed within the next 2 hours. And it's a great way to motivate and create new material. And what I think is so interesting about what Dr. Kip said was, even though a goal may seem like an outcome-oriented approach, what we're really involving ourselves in is the process of creating the specific, measurable, adjustable, realistic, time-sensitive goal. And that's engaging us in a process. According to Dr. Kip, the best coaches and athletes in all fields seem to employ a process-focused approach, even in sports where their job hinges on outcomes. That is, whether or not they win or lose. Another concept I found super interesting is this psychological sweet spot that Dr. Kip called the peak performance zone. And this peak performance zone rests between being totally checked out or blasé about what's going on, and then being so anxious or overstimulated that you can't focus. And this tends to happen during auditions or when you're performing. I've even had great lessons one-on-one with coaches in this zone. Maybe you've had training sessions or gotten off stage and felt like you nailed it, but you don't actually know why or how you got to your peak performance zone. And what Dr. Kip recommends is first identifying which side of the spectrum you're on. So do you get too hyped up before you have to go on stage or audition or even take a class? Or do you have trouble finding the energy you need? And then, once you know that, you can develop a routine in your warm-up that will help you get to the right headspace. And this absolutely varies from person to person. It kind of takes me back to Laura Stokes' episode, I think it was episode 12, where she talks about putting herself in a mental state by doing child's pose for 20 minutes, or jumping up and down and being extremely active. Depending on how she wants to have her training session or her performance go, she does physical things that put her in a mental state. So I think that the key takeaway is what you need for yourself is something repeatable and reliable that can prepare you mentally for your lesson or your audition or your performance. That mental preparation is as important as the physical preparation. And the last thing I want to address are the psychological effects of injury. One of the things people always ask me when they find out I'm an aerialist is, isn't that dangerous? Aren't you scared you're going to get hurt? And I think what a lot of people don't understand is, yes, it is dangerous and you can get hurt. As I've said before, circus artists do assume some amount of risk. I've established that since episode 1. But I don't think people quite understand that bodies heal and circus artists are incredibly disciplined and resilient. And as a result, we tend to, assuming there's no real brain trauma, rehabilitate pretty astoundingly. However, what happens to an acrobat's mental health after injury is virtually never considered. I experienced this firsthand about 3 years ago. I was in a very serious relationship with a guy who had a contract in Germany. This was in 2015 or 16, I think. And I finished up some work in the States, and I hadn't seen him in like 3 months. I flew to Germany to be with him. And 3 days after I arrived, he ruptured his bicep tendon. He's an aerialist as well. And it really destroyed him. He, within about 5 hours of rupturing his bicep tendon, broke up with me. He pushed a ton of people away during that time and made some really unhealthy choices. And it was really sad to watch him go through that. And I wish that he had a psychologist like Dr. Kip to help him work through the emotions. So if you or someone you know experiences an injury from circus, please know that there's so much more that can get broken than just a piece of the body, and that feelings of fear and helplessness or guilt or even relief are totally normal. And consider during your rehabilitation process not just a good physical therapist, but even just 2 or 3 sessions with a qualified sports psychologist. I know it's not usually covered under U.S. insurance, but it's really worth it because these are people who can help you understand what you're going through and resume a level of mental health that's required to be an artist-athlete. Just like you need a specialized physical therapist who can get you not just back to normal performance, that means being able to walk or drive a car, you need a physical therapist who can get you back to being at a level where you can perform. You also may need to spend some time with a specialized psychologist who can get you back to a strong mental state as well. There's a very strong connection between your brain and your body, and as Dr. Kip said, there are actual psychological tools that can help speed up the rehabilitation process. To find a sports psychologist, you can contact Division 47 of the American Psychological Association. Online, that's www.apadivisions.org/division-47. You can also go to aasp.org for a database of licensed sports psychologists. Whew. Okay, well, it's really intense sharing personal things on this podcast. So thanks for listening, guys. If you like what you hear, you can help out the Artist Athlete podcast by subscribing, rating, and reviewing on whatever platform you're listening on. And to become a Patreon, visit patreon.com/theartistathlete. You can also find me online at theartistathlete.com or on Instagram for training tips at _artist_athlete. Thank you so much for tuning in, guys, and I will talk to you next week.